Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, the second in our series of Westminster Faith debates. The subject this evening is faith in schools. We had the first of our debates a couple of weeks ago. We felt it was generally very successful, and the research that's been done has had a fair degree of publicity and has been able to stimulate a wider debate. The subject is close to my own heart. I was Secretary of State for Education when we brought in a non-statutory religious education framework, and the issues of the place of the curriculum in general, of faith schools, of the place of religious worship in schools and so on, was a constant theme when I was Secretary of State. And I'm really delighted that the work that's been done in the research field is going to take this forward and take the discussion forward. Before introducing everybody, perhaps I should explain how we're going to proceed this evening. We have two of our academics who've done the research, which is outstanding, Professor James Conroy and Professor Robert Jackson, who are going to be introduced properly by Professor Linda Woodhead, my colleague at the University of Lancaster. I will then introduce our two respondents to the debate, Professor Richard Dawkins and John Pritchard, the Bishop of Oxford, who will give a response to the papers which have been produced, and then we'll throw it open to the floor for open discussion. We're asking all of the speakers to constrain themselves to 10 minutes, and I have a vigorous group of stop-and-go signs to stop that, and I will try and enforce that to the best of my ability, and in order that there is proper time for contribution from the floor later on. I just want to thank a couple of people who've made these debates possible. At the University of Lancaster, within the Faculty of Politics, Philosophy and Religion, we're very glad that the head of that school, Robert Geyer, is with us this evening. Rebecca Catto and Peter Ainsworth have helped Linda tremendously in the work, and we really appreciate the work that they have done. We've also been very much assisted by Elizabeth Hunter from Theos, the think tank, who's helped do this work and develop it and take it forward. So I do want to say thank you to all of them. But perhaps thanks most of all to Rick Rylance, who's here this evening, the Chief Executive of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, because the funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Councils over the last 5 years have been absolutely fundamental to the success of this project. I'm also instructed to remind you of the hashtag for this event, for all of you who are up to this, I think, rather close to divine intervention. And the hashtag for this evening is #WFD12, if you want to tweet in. So with that, I'll introduce Professor Linda Woodhead in order to introduce our researchers. Linda.
Thank you, Charles. As you might have anticipated, probably the most controversial issue that we'll be talking about tonight is faith schools, which is fine, but it's not the only issue in town. And our aim in this whole series of debates is to paint a bigger picture of the place of faith in society, a picture which is informed by good research to move the debates on. And the big picture here is how we teach religion in schools, especially in state-funded schools, because that's where most of us were educated, leaving aside the odd Labour Party member. So,
vicious, you academic.
So when I selected which research project leaders from the programme to speak today, I chose the two here who have the widest ranging research projects on the Religion Society programme, and also very extensive experience and knowledge of RE in the UK and indeed in Europe. Before turning to them in a second, let me just mention two other projects on the programme that may be of interest. As you'll have gathered, this programme, which is highlighted on the banner behind me, is actually a cluster of 75 different research projects that have been running now for 6 years. So there are projects on all sorts of topics. And if you want to find out about those, and there are short project finding summaries and podcasts and all sorts of nice things, including broadcasts of these debates, then just Google Religion and Society. We will come up top, I hope. So just to mention two projects which you can find more about on that site. One is by Mark Pike, who looked at 5 Christian ethos schools, faith schools, in the North East in 2007-8. including the very controversial Emmanuel schools. You may remember that Rod Liddell and other people have highlighted concerns about them. They're the Vardy schools, the schools sponsored by Peter Vardy. So there is a piece of research by someone who went into those schools and looked at what happens in them. Another project of interest is by Dr. Alison Marwini, and that's called Opting Out of RE. And she was looking at the Northern Irish situation. And her sort of summary of her project findings is opting out of RE could and should be easier, a case study from Northern Ireland. A few very basic facts and figures to set this debate in context. The mention of Northern Ireland makes me remember that we need to distinguish between the educational systems in England and Wales, which we're mainly going to be talking about tonight, and in Northern Ireland and Scotland, which are separate and different, of course. The kind of religious picture that we're looking at today, and the whole school system that we're looking at still today, really dates from 1944 and is part and parcel of the whole welfare state project. When it was brought into being by Rab Butler, around half of schools in England and Wales, if we exclude public schools, were church schools. Today, that's around a third, still around a third, so still quite a significant number of schools which have a religious character in the jargon. Most of these are so-called voluntary schools. That's a term that dates from their incorporation under Butler. Some voluntary aided, some voluntary controlled. And recently they've been joined by academies which have a religious character. Some of them are actually voluntary schools that have been taken into academy status, and some are new foundations like those Vardy schools I just mentioned. All state schools are required, it's statutory, to teach RE and have daily acts of collective worship. As I'm sure our collective experience in the room will know, how RE is taught has changed from religious instruction, much more Christian-based and confessional, to religious education. That change was recognised legally in the 1988 Education Reform Act and is reinforced in the non-statutory National Framework for RE 2004, which actually, Charles, I think you were responsible for introducing that non-statutory guidance. And there is, for RE, there is a legal opt-out clause for all parents. That's what the other project was talking about, looking at how well that works. Faith schools may give priority to applicants who are of the faith of the schools, but admit other applicants if they're undersubscribed. What kind of religions are represented in faith schools? Well, they're still predominantly Christian, around 68% Anglican, 30% Catholic. Of the remaining, there are just 38 Jewish schools, 11 Muslim, 3 Sikh, 1 Hindu, and some free church and ecumenical Christian. Final statistic, about 15 million people alive today went to a Church of England school. One reason why we're so pleased to have the Bishop of Oxford here with us. So, there's a bit of context and background, and I want to now hand over to Professor Robert Jackson. He's Professor of Education at the University of Warwick and Director of the Warwick Religions and Education Research Unit, as well as being Professor at the European Wergeland Centre, which is a Council of Europe-related centre based in Oslo, which specialises in intercultural and human rights education. Robert.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our debate this evening is about religion in schools in Britain. But there's a danger that we get so sucked into our own national preoccupations that we lose perspective. My own research on the Religion and Society programme and in other Warwick projects looks at schools across the UK. But my work also extends into Europe. And it's from this wider European perspective that I want to speak this evening. Above all, I suggest that along with key European institutions, such as the Council of Europe, we need to ground our thinking about religious education in a human rights framework. Now, since 9/11, the Council of Europe, which was set up to protect human rights and whose remit extends to democratic education, has started to take religion in education very seriously. I've had the privilege to be involved in this work and in disseminating the recommendation from the Committee of Ministers. That's the 47 foreign ministers of the member states, of course, including the UK foreign minister, about teaching religions and other worldviews in schools. What this amounts to is a recognition that every young person in Europe has a right to hold a particular view, whether religious or secular, within the limits of the law. I think we can move forward in our own debates if we take this commitment to liberal democracy, underpinned by human rights, as our starting point, and treat it as, in principle, inclusive of all. We must not lose sight, in my view, of the importance of an education which covers all areas of human experience, including mathematical, scientific, aesthetic, philosophical, including the ethical, linguistic, historical, religious and spiritual, and so on. And I wish politicians would go back more to breadth in education related to the whole human person, and not just contemporary utility. However, instrumental reasons are important, whether about students' personal development or about social issues, such as developing cultural understanding or promoting social cohesion. A combination of intrinsic and instrumental justifications gives attention to all aspects of human experience, as well as addressing pressing issues. So what does this mean for religion and education in Britain today? I'll start with religious education in fully state-funded schools and then move on to say something about faith-based schools. And when I refer to religious education, you know, a term that is used in so many different ways, I'm thinking mainly here of fully state-funded schools in England and Wales. As Linda has already said, the situation is different in Scotland and also in Northern Ireland. So here are a couple of observations based on my team's recent research. First, many adolescents interviewed give strong support to applying democratic principles in the classroom. They see the classroom as a potential, though not always actual, safe space for dialogue, and they want peaceful coexistence based on knowledge about each other's religions and worldviews, so knowledge is very important, but also doing things together and sharing common interests. On the whole, students with a firm religious or secular commitment do not feel threatened by dialogue with others or learning about others. But some, especially those from small minorities in the classroom, do feel vulnerable, and that needs to be taken on board. Second, many religious students do not identify with the portrayal of their own religion, especially by the media, but also sometimes by some teachers and in many books and electronic resources. They find it difficult to recognize themselves or their own families in some of the descriptions that are given. Too many teaching materials provide only superficial factual information and do not address issues of meaning in relation to religious language and the experience of religious people. From these findings follow various suggestions for improving RE, including the following. Great care needs to be taken over the ways in which religions are represented to young people. For example, their internal diversity needs to be indicated and explored. Second, the geographical and social contexts of schools need to be taken seriously and sometimes suggest different starting points and approaches in teaching. Thirdly, competences are important as well as knowledge. For example, dialogue between students should be taken more seriously. There are some interesting experiments going on in moderated pupil-to-pupil dialogue. We've done some work on this at Warwick, and the Tony Blair Faith Foundation uses this dialogical approach in its Face to Faith project, which brings adolescents together from many different countries by video conferencing. And we have a group of people in our Warwick team who are currently evaluating that project. I turn now to the issue of faith-based schools. Now, Linda has already explained that England has a long tradition of partially state-funded faith-based schools, and she's also explained that they are of different types. In our experience as researchers, and I should say we haven't done a project specifically on faith-based schools, but many faith-based schools have taken part in projects that we've done with schools in general. So first, in our experience, they are extremely diverse. We're not talking about one kind of thing. At one end of the spectrum, they're inclusive and they're outward looking, introducing young people to religious diversity in society. They do not use their status in order to proselytize, but as a basis for serving the community. At the other extreme, there are faith-based schools which maintain exclusivity. Their core activity is to transmit a particular faith tradition, and they avoid contact with other types of schools. They're two extremes. But non-faith-based schools also vary in the ways in which they relate to issues of religion. At one end of the spectrum, schools recognize and respect religious and ethnic difference in society. They create links with the community, including with different religious bodies, and are generally inclusive and outward-looking. At the other end are schools showing little or no interest in religious diversity and giving little support to religious education as a subject. Again, two extremes. As for justifying publicly funded faith-based schools in a democratic society, I return to my starting point. We need to refer to international law based on human rights principles concerning the rights of parents and the rights of children. In European law, parents have the right to bring up children in their own religious tradition. Whether the state is willing to fund such education is up to the state. Some do, some don't. Children, of course, also have rights, but their autonomy in law is governed by judgments about their maturity, and advice from legal specialists suggests that disputes between parents and children who claim maturity would need to be dealt with as individual cases. So, in conclusion, a European perspective reminds us that the right to hold a particular viewpoint within the law and parents' right to have their children educated in their religion are fundamental freedoms which we must respect within the context of our different national histories of education. And turning back to religious education in general, we need better provision. We need to strengthen its place in the curriculum. We need to strengthen teacher training, and we need to provide high-quality resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Our second speaker is Professor James Conroy, who is Professor of Religious and Philosophical Education at the University of Glasgow. He's also probably exhausted. You may have seen today in the Daily Telegraph, in the Daily Mail, and you and yours yesterday on some local channels. They've all picked up on his talk and his finding that less than £1 is spent on RE resources on average. So he's a rather busy man at the moment. So sorry about that, James, but thanks for making it. Hope we can get through tonight.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. There are these things called pound shops I think I'm going to be known as the pound academic from now on, for which I can only revel in the joy of. But I am going to be concerned with the national preoccupation. I concur with many of the things that Robert has said. We do have some differences, but the research that we conducted over the last 3.5 years would point to in some detail, some of the issues that he raises. This was a three-year ethnographic look at 24 schools. We invited nearly 150 schools to join our project. We struggled to get 24. And when I asked many of the heads of religious education why they didn't want to partake in the project, they said they weren't sure that their religious education would stand up to the scrutiny. And that's a very serious issue. It's not that these were bad people doing a bad job. They were good people trying to do a very good job in very difficult circumstances. And what we found was that the circumstances were rather more difficult than even I had anticipated. And I was accused in the Telegraph today of being self-serving by writing this report in this way. I can guarantee you, if it was self-serving in the interest of religious education, I'd have written it very differently. But does it matter? If religious education is in the kind of state that I'm going to suggest, does it actually matter? Shouldn't we let religious education wither on the vine? My argument is absolutely not, because where we saw religious education conducted effectively, it was brilliant. It was some of the best teaching that children got. What our study revealed was something absolutely fundamental to the education of young people. The creation of a space for serious, critical exploration of the meanings and values by which we live. To live good lives individually and collectively, we need to be able to make sense of the world and of ourselves. And religious education, still, for all its failings, is the only site that systemically and systematically tries to give a place in the curriculum for that. But what does good religious education look like? As I said, we based our conclusions on in-depth observation and interview in 24 schools across the UK. Some of them were religiously denominated, many of them weren't. They stretched from London through the home county shires to the northeast, to Scotland, to Northern Ireland. And as Robert says, many of them displayed quite unique characteristics. So lumping everything together is never easy. The schools were self-selecting as places that identified good religious education. They saw themselves as teaching good religious education. Because, of course, it's very easy to pathologize anything. I can find a lousy example of any social practice and turn that lousy example into a reason for disbanding the social practice. So we didn't want to pathologize religious education. We wanted to find sites where it was well conducted. The first characteristic, then, of good religious education that we observed is that it involves close engagement with the community in which the school is located. The best schools for religious education were not necessarily religiously denominated schools, but were those schools that recognized the religious composition of the community which they served. And they were willing to engage with that community, not least in relation to the beliefs of their own pupils. It did not matter what the religious profile was. One of the most outstanding schools that we observed had pupils primarily from the Indian subcontinent with a range of faiths. Another was almost entirely Muslim. Another was largely Christian. What they all had in common was a belief that religious education was important in relation to the community. A second characteristic is that the best religious education teachers do not merely describe in an exam-obsessed they don't describe in an exam-obsessed way the basic phenomena of religion or indeed of a secular tradition. They explore with the students the kind of meanings which underlie ritual, social and personal practices. For example, in one lesson, Muslim students were allowed to explore the underpinning theology of Salat, the ritual act of praying 5 times a day, a practice which is often simply a given in their community. In another example, a teacher didn't shy away from pupils' desire to discuss Islamic terrorism, but taught them about different interpretations of jihad and allowed them to explore in some depth the claims often made by terrorists, to see how far these were indeed theological claims. The point here is that if we really intend that children should learn from religion as well as about religion, then they must be introduced to the intellectual practice of trying to understand a particular set of beliefs and practices in their own epistemological terms. They have to, in other words, get in what Gerard Manley Hopkins might have referred to as the inscape of these belief systems. That's not an invitation to accept them, it's an invitation to get on the inside of them. And if I turn to poor religious education, it probably goes without saying is that a good feature of religious education would be that it was well-resourced. Success depends on adequate time, accurate description, good resources, well-educated teachers, high-quality materials, and institutional support. Despite the often heroic efforts of individual teachers, those elements were far too often missing. Good resourcing was frighteningly dependent upon the personal disposition of the head teacher. But what marked poor provision above everything was teaching which contented itself with introducing students to the surface phenomena of religion. We saw teachers fall into the trap of responding to serious questions. But why does it matter that Jesus died on a cross? By deflecting it or asking another student to answer it. So I think while one might want to reverence dialogue, our experience was there was an awful lot of dialogue with not much substance. And that's teachers. I was accused, of that the real problem today was apparently that too few students were having religion foisted on them. In not one of the schools that we observed was that the case. Quite the reverse. Teachers had a timidity about making any substantive claim about anything. So you end up, prima facie, a lot of this dialogue looks like democratization. We're democratizing the curriculum. We're giving voice to people. But what it actually ends up as is superficiality, often driven by this fear of making substantive claims. And so when we were interviewing in one of the focus groups some of the students in the school, and we were asking them about how useful did they find it? How useful do you find religious education? A young woman said, let me put it this way. If a Jew came round for tea, I'd know what to feed them. Learning facts may be important, but it doesn't help you to grasp the shape of somebody else's life. So, I think that religious education is riven with ambiguity and ambivalence. That is an ambiguity and ambivalence which sits astride the whole of British education, but which finds particular resonance in the religious education classroom. Most recently, in the refusal to admit it to the EBAC. We're on time. To admit it to the EBAC, while simultaneously requiring that it still stay on the curriculum as a mandatory subject. This is just palpable nonsense. It is also seen in the lengthy and often incompatible set of aims and objectives with which religious education is freighted. And they include everything from religious literacy, citizenship education, multicultural awareness, social cohesion, philosophical understanding, moral development, understanding heritage, sex and relationships education, and you can keep going. And any teacher that can do all of that and do it well is a genius. All these things are important, but religious education cannot carry them all. Our study found that in many state schools, £1 or less, in one instance 60 pence was spent per pupil per annum on all the resources for religious education. A young woman rang me up subsequently, or emailed me subsequently. She just started teaching in a high school in England, and she wanted my advice because her head teacher had decided to take religious education off timetable and give fourth year students 1 day a year and fifth year students 1 day a year. Don't bother. Whatever else it is not education. Religious education, I would argue, matters as never before. And one of the reasons that there's been a huge rise in the number of people submitting for religious education for GCSE and standard grade in Scotland is that RE teachers pressed want to give it substance. But what they find is that they have to give it substance in much less time than other humanities subjects. So how can they treat something with the seriousness it deserves without the resource to do so? Religious education matters as never before. We cannot understand our own culture without religious knowledge, let alone that of others. As religious and secular diversity increases, students need to be able to articulate their own beliefs and engage seriously with those of others. As respect and social harmony, I do believe, depend on this. What is happening to religious education in our schools is a scandal, for which I think we will pay a high price in years to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, James and Robert. I think those are two absolutely excellent presentations to feed our discussion further on. So we now move to our two public respondents, and the first of those is Richard Dawkins. You described, Linda, that James might be exhausted by what's going on. I think, Richard, you've had a pretty exhausting week or so as well around the media, and I'd just like to make one preliminary remark, which I hope speaks on behalf of all in the room. You're a controversial figure, you speak controversially, but some of the attacks on you personally, going back to your forebears and origins that we've seen in the media in the last couple of days, I think are quite unacceptable. We may agree or disagree with whatever you have to say, but we think that this type of forum is the place to do it in a civilised way and listen to what you say, rather than smear you in various other ways. And I just want to place that on record, given some of the comments that have been made. You were an academic at the University of Oxford. My sister-in-law was taught by you in the 1970s, and she told me when I was discussing with you what a tremendous teacher you were. You've written very widely, but I'm just going to pick two books. 1976, The Selfish Gene, an academic research work indicating the importance of the gene in evolution. And you then became, at Oxford, the Professor of the Public Understanding of Science from 1995 to 2008, during which period you wrote The God Delusion in 2006. And you've become a spokesman of a whole range of opinion on these kinds of matters. And it's a great pleasure to us and a privilege that you've been ready to come this evening. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you in particular for your kind words just now. There's a running dichotomy that we've been hearing from both the speakers between learning about religion and learning religion in the sense of learning from religion, to use James Conroy's phrase. I would say learning about religion is something I'm thoroughly in favour of, and I would call it religious literacy. And a subset of that would be biblical literacy. Religious literacy seems to me extremely important because you need to understand religion in order to understand history and, regrettably, modern world affairs too. So whether you have a religious belief yourself or not, nobody could deny that there's an immensely important influence from religion on people's minds and hence on history and world affairs. Biblical literacy as well, I think, is immensely important. It's an essential part of being educated. Christianity is part of our national culture. It's in our cultural DNA, to use the Kant phrase. And so many great works of art, for example, have a religious theme. You can't appreciate the symbolism, the iconography, without religious literacy. In my book, The God Delusion, which Charles Clark has referred to, somebody told me this was actually on the syllabus of our... was I being... It's very,
no such luck.
Very nice thought. Very nice thought. No, okay. In that book, I listed 129 phrases that everybody would recognize, just part of everyday speech, idioms almost, which come from the Bible, and most people don't even realize they come from the Bible. And things like a man after his own heart, I escaped with the skin of my teeth, the voice crying in the wilderness, the salt of the earth, hide your light under a bushel, I wash my hands of it, the road to Damascus, forbidden fruit, the Good Samaritan, all these sorts of phrases. If you're trying to understand English literature, you won't get it unless you are steeped in probably the King James Bible. I must say I was rather shocked by one result that we found in our Ipsos Mori poll, which we published last week. My friends aren't the only ones who've done research to found out, first of all, how many people in the very week after the census had ticked the Christian box. You remember that the 2011 census actually asked people to name their religion, if they had any. And our first finding was that the number of people, the percentage of people who ticked the Christian box appears to have gone down from 72% in 2001 to about 54% in 2011. We then took the 54%, the ones who ticked the Christian box, and asked them a number of other questions, and those are very interesting results in themselves, by the way. But among the questions, we asked them, what is the first book of the New Testament? And the word new was emphasized. And they were given a choice of the following: Matthew, Genesis, Acts of the Apostles, Psalms, plus don't know and prefer not to say. Well, we're all, I think, educators in this room, or interested in education, and you might wish to guess how many of these people who had ticked the Christian box, they nominate themselves as Christian, knew what is the first book in the New Testament. The answer, I'm sorry to report, was only 35%. 39% ticked don't know, 25% ticked one or other of the available wrong answers. Remember, this was polling only those who identified themselves as Christian. Now, of course, I wouldn't suggest that the order of the books in the rather arbitrarily thrown together canon has any deep theological significance. I'm not actually very concerned about educating people in theological significance, but I am concerned with biblical literacy for the reasons that I've given. And I leave you pondering the figure I've given you. 35% of people who identify themselves as Christians know that Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. It's as though a sample of people who had self-identified as devotees of English literature were unable to pick out the author of Hamlet from a list consisting of Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Chaucer, and Homer. So I suppose I should agree with James Conroy's conclusion that RE is in poor state, but we'd probably disagree about about why that matters. Picking out a few points from his speech and Robert Jackson's, both of them repeatedly show that they accept the almost universal convention that it's right to label children with the religion of their parents. This is a bee in my bonnet, and I can't think of a better audience to allow it to buzz in than a conference on religious education. If I were to speak of a socialist child, or a conservative child, or a Keynesian child, or a Hayekian monetarist child, or a postmodernist child, meaning a child whose parents subscribe to one of those views, you'd be shocked. How dare you label a child with the political and economic opinions of her parents? Shouldn't you ask the child her own opinion? Or if she's too young for that, wait until she's old enough. Robert Jackson told us that in European law, parents have the right to bring up children in their own religious tradition, which sounds like a good liberal freedom. But suppose it was suggested that parents have the right to bring up children in their own economic or political tradition. We'd all be hopping up and down with indignation. We're bringing Tommy up as a Hayekian monetarist. We're bringing Maisie up as a Levi-Straussian structuralist. We're bringing Katie up as a Jungian. That's preposterous. Yet our whole society swallows without a peep. We're bringing Sophie up Catholic, or Muslim, whatever it is. Our entire society swallows the assumption that it's right automatically and without question to label a child with the religion of her parents and to send her to an appropriate school. Automatically and without question, we accept that. Why? Why the double standard? What's so special about religion that we not only allow parents to impose it on their children, but assume without giving it a second thought that this will automatically happen? So several times in the speakers this evening we've heard about Catholic children, Muslim children. Robert Jackson referred to the importance in the classroom of knowledge about each other's religion, once again assuming that every child has a religion and that the religion is presumably the religion of their parents. I'm glad Robert Jackson went on to say that children also have rights, and he added that these are governed by judgments about their maturity. In other words, when is the child old enough to decide which religion, if any, she supports. Well, I'm in no position to say what is the right age, of course, but I do note that we recognize 18 as the moment when you're allowed to vote. It may or may not be the right age, but what we do not do is assume that before a child reaches maturity, it's going to vote the same way as its parents do. Yet that's precisely what we do when we label a child a Catholic child or a Church of England child or a Muslim child. So there are many objections to faith schools. They're divisive, discriminatory. In some cases, they actively teach scientific falsehoods, like the Islamic schools that I'm reliably informed teach literalistic Quranic creationism instead of scientific evolution. And those are all serious objections, but for me, not the least objection to faith schools is that their very foundation and definition depends on the assumption that it's right to label a child with the faith of her parents, a practice that nobody would dream of doing in the case of any other view of the parents. And this is kind of enshrined in the rather widespread and deplorable practice of parents pretending to be religious and going to church in order to convince a school that they belong to this particular religion and therefore that they should be accepted in the school concerned. Well, I've run out of time. I will just conclude by repeating that I think there's a great deal to be said for religious education in the sense of teaching about religion and biblical literacy. Both those things, by the way, I suspect will prepare a child to give up religion. If you're taught comparative religion, you're more likely to realize that there are other religions than the one you've been brought up in. And if you are taught to read the Bible, then I can think of almost nothing more calculated to turn you off religion. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
Our second respondent is the Right Reverend John Pritchard, the Bishop of Oxford. John has had a very distinguished career in the church. He was born in Salford. He's served in Birmingham, in Bath and Wells, in Durham and Canterbury, in Jarrow, before becoming the Bishop of Oxford since 2007. His particular role in relation to the subject we're discussing this evening is that he's responsible for the General Synod of the Church of England's Board of Education, which has got responsibilities in relation to all the Church of England faith schools throughout the country. And so he's very, very actively involved in these debates, understands them, and is responsible for some of the decisions which are taken in relation to them. John, we're very grateful to you for giving time this evening. Thank you very much, Bishop of Oxford.
Pleasure to be here, Charles. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sticking more with religious education rather than church schools. I guess we may go out into that direction later on, but that's as I saw the two papers, and that's what I've tried to respond to. And it does seem to me that good quality RE today has never been more needed and is never been more under threat. I'm glad that the real educational value of good RE has been recognised in the research, but I recognise there is good and bad RE, and I'm very concerned that we don't slip back into the bad old days of the 1970s and 80s, because an awful lot of progress has been made since then, but I do think RE is almost back on the edge. Let me explain why I think RE is necessary to a mature society and why it's so vulnerable. In the first place, good RE trains young people to think, to inquire, to argue, to evaluate evidence, to read texts, to make moral choices. Robert Jackson pointed out that the students of RE see the classroom as a potential safe space for this kind of engagement and dialogue as they pursue what he called peaceful, respectful coexistence. And this is where they can learn to engage freely with ideas and to respect both themselves and to respect others. Secondly, good RE encourages serious critical exploration of the meanings, values, and beliefs by which we live. That's what James Conroy found, and he said that RE, quotes, offers the only place in the curriculum where that can still be done systematically. And this is so much more than the phenomenological study, what I call kind of food and festivals RE. It's about what makes us and others tick. It's about what gives our lives purpose. It's about what gets us up in the morning. It's about life. Thirdly, good RE helps students understand this complex world which is their present and their future. A world where 75% of people express loyalty to one of the great faith traditions or another. And where, of course, religion has such an impact on global, national and local politics, again, for good and ill. Absolutely, I admit that. You can't understand modern politics, I would say, without understanding the difference between Christianity and Islam, for instance. But unless we understand the profound energy that there is in religion and which seems to motivate billions of people in this world, we're stuck at first base. And to leave religion to the extremists outside of a good educational process is highly dangerous, as we've seen, to our cost. So religion can be healthy and unhealthy, just as I hope you'd say, Richard, that atheism can be healthy and unhealthy. There's all sorts, and I fully admit we have some bad religion around. So we have to understand it, and I think to some degree, experience it. Just as in science classes, you have to do experiments and not just read theory. RE is about building a better world, as far as I'm concerned. Fourthly, and this is where the bias towards Christianity in British RE, I think, validly comes into play, good RE helps students understand the culture they live in, as Richard was saying, where so much has been shaped by the Christian faith. We may not agree on all the things that I think have been shaped by it, but it seems to me that the democratic tradition, the legal system, modern science, ethics, history, art, music, poetry, literature, so much has been influenced, shaped indeed by Christianity. And we're lost in our culture if we remain religiously illiterate, as was often said last year when we were celebrating 400 years of the King James Version of the Bible. Fifth, students themselves seem to recognize the importance of good RE. They relish it. Good RE, I'm talking about. The number of students taking RE, GCSE, long course or short course, rose from 113,000 to 460,000 in 15 years. Now, granted, the short course was a good way of meeting the requirements of compulsory RE, but the number of A-level students also tripled. Philosophy and ethics were especially popular because they scratch where young people itch. They're part of what John Milton called a complete and generous education. I like that phrase. We'd probably call it holistic, and it's what Robert Jackson was appealing for when he said, I wish politicians would go back more to breadth in education, related to the whole human person, and not just contemporary utility. And that's what RE helps. It helps that roundedness. So those are some of the reasons I believe in good RE. And remember, the British Humanist Association argues for good RE too. And as James Conroy pointed out, the picture is very mixed. And just now, the government is displaying what he calls a crippling ambivalence about RE. I just want to turn to that now. Just look at the facts. Fact 1. RE has been excluded from the EBAC with the result that there's been a 30% fall in the amount of time committed to RE teaching and learning, with a consequent loss of staff. The government says RE is safe because it's compulsory, but the danger is of a return to the PE teacher having to teach RE last lesson on a Tuesday afternoon because he had a spare. Do you remember? RE was the fastest growing exam subject in the country, but not now, out of the EBAC, out of the gold standard. Fact 2, the government has excluded RE from the new round of curriculum development. I've regularly asked the government for an RE review parallel to the National Curriculum Review, but I think successive administrations have said, RE, there be dragons, we'll stay away. RE needs an upgrade. Fact 3, guidance and support for RE has been removed from the websites of the Qualifications and Curriculum Development Agency and the National Curriculum. What sort of a message is that? Take all the information away. Fact 4, the number of places for trainee RE teachers has been reduced over 2 years from 655 to 400. And the allocations this year are for 2/3 of the cohorts to be in single figures, which is said by the government to be non-viable. So the quality and the quantity of RE teaching is bound to fall. Because CPD can only do so much, can't it? It can't invent new teachers. So I agree with James when he says that what's happening to RE in our schools is a scandal for which we'll have to pay a high price in years to come. I actually don't think this is a conspiracy by the government at all. I think government hasn't reckoned really with the unintended consequences of what it's been doing. But then those are the most dangerous sorts of consequences, aren't they? Call to the bar, the war in Iraq, letting Greece into the Eurozone, or inviting John Terry to captain England. But we are where we are. And that, I think, impressive body, the RE Council, will pick up the cause and establish a national curriculum review of RE, which will be consistent with the thinking of the government's new national curriculum. They'll also work to improve the quality of RE teacher training and CPD, and they're doing that, encouraged in fact by the government. So why not do it in partnership? I was glad to see that last week MPs have set up an all-party parliamentary group on RE. As Stephen Lloyd said, MP, he said, in today's world where our children can be open to an enormous amount of misleading information, I believe it's absolutely essential that they are taught about different cultures and religions by trained, experienced RE teachers, allowing children to make informed choices. Absolutely. So it's Ash Wednesday today. Most young people wouldn't know what that means. And maybe that's okay. Or maybe that's a shame. Because I think good RE would drill down beneath the surface of the day, the ash on the forehead, the Lenten resolutions, and get into a whole artesian well of issues about personal responsibility, social justice, public symbols, and the like. Good RE could be a game changer in creating that complete and generous education that Milton spoke about. So let's keep researching and working at it and doing it. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. I think you'll all agree we've had 4 excellent presentations covering this field. We've got about 35 minutes now for contributions from you. I'm going to take the comments or questions in groups of 3. There are colleagues round the room who've got microphones. I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone when you indicate. You can address questions to individuals on the panel, or more generally, or more widely. And just to say, Linda's just reminding me, this whole debate is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, though I can't see why you wouldn't want to be recorded, please don't contribute. And that's the state of affairs. Thank you for that reminder, Linda. The opt-out clause, we say yes. So I'm going to take comments from the floor, and then I'll bring in, as appropriate, the platform to respond to what's being said. And could you identify where you're from? I'm going to take first the gentleman there. Just there. Second, gentleman right at the back. Yes, that's you, just waving. Thirdly, the lady at the front here. So first, the gentleman there. If you could identify yourself, please.
Good evening, panel. God bless you all. I'm Dr. Ramsey from Muslim Council of Britain. I would like to have a word of thanks for Professor Richard Dawkins, and as Imam, and of course, a small criticism. In tradition of God, that when the time comes where his name is not remembered and has almost faded away, he used to send something similar to messengers or perhaps an unnatural phenomenon in order to test their faith and sincerity, to remind people that he's there and that his name should be honored. I believe his name was fading away, and thanks to you, Professor Dawkins, have brought it back by promoting denial and rejection of God. Your action have in fact helped a vast number of people rediscover their faith in God. Of course, in this process, many of the weak will be lost. However, those who had even the smallest amount of faith are now being inspired and are in fact returning to God. Your action have in fact awakened the desire to search for and believe in God in multi-millions across the world. In this aspect, I am grateful to you. Now is a question. Of course, in this country
Dr.
we
Ramsey,
have...
if you can make it quite quick.
Very
please,
quick,
I'd
very
appreciate
quick. Sorry, I do apologize. In this country, we have over over 70 Islamic schools and thousands of supplementary schools, and of course we have a faith school, and of course we have tens of thousands of Christians, which are all promoting peace and harmony. I would like to ask, in general, why, Professor Richard Dawkins, why do you think it is necessary to adopt such an aggressive manner when dealing with the subject of faith? It appears that you are demonstrating exactly the type of intolerance that you are criticizing others for. Thank you.
Okay. Just to say, well, I'll come to the panel after the three questions, but just to say that though the question was directed directly at Professor Dawkins, and I'll ask him to respond, I'll also ask other people on the panel if they've got anything they'd like to say. And the gentleman at the back.
Good evening. My name is James Townsend. I have a couple of interests to declare. One is that I'm a member of the General Synod of the Church of England. Another is that I was until very recently a teacher on the Teach First programme, and I'm now working for Teach First in an ambassadorial capacity. You may be able to see where this is going if you know what Teach First is. I'm delighted that all the panel agree about the shameful level of some of the RE teaching that happens in our country, some of the RE teaching. And I'm also delighted that everybody agrees about how important it is that we get it right. It strikes me that the most valuable resource in any classroom is worth much more than £1, and it's the teacher, who actually could teach with very few other resources. If you've got an absolutely fantastic teacher, you can achieve extraordinary things, and it matters that they're passionate not only about the subject that they're teaching, but also about the importance for those children that they're teaching and the impact that it can have. So I suppose my question is, what can we do to make sure that the very best people are going into the classrooms to teach religious studies, and we get them in the classrooms that need them most?
Thank you. And the lady at the front here.
So my name's Rabina Katun. I'm also actually a trainee teacher on my PGCE in a cohort that has single figures, bearing in mind that the £6,000 bursary that was prepared to be given to RE teachers has now been taken away. I'm funding that myself. I suppose my question is partially to Professor Dawkins and then Professor Conroy. Firstly, Professor Dawkins, why is it that you don't think the 82, so learning from religion, is as important as learning about religion? And then sort of to Professor Conroy, taking that forward, in terms of, I think you mentioned the phenomenological pedagogy. I think personally it's just poor deliverance and a lack of training in pedagogies for trainee teachers. I myself have done quite an extensive reading, and it's luckily for me because I have a very good tutor. I don't think in other universities that's necessarily the case. But then I have to also ask, learning from religion, as important as I find it, isn't important to teachers in school because it's not in the exam. The exam question will say, give us 3 reasons why you agree with euthanasia, and give a Christian perspective. Give 3 reasons why a different perspective might be held. And those are both religious viewpoints. But those exam questions are always going to be 81, which is learning about religion. So as important as I find 82, and I would disagree that 81 in itself is not the most important, I have to then ask, where do we bring in examining bodies in regards to how we deliver RE in the classroom, and how, as a teacher, I can do that actually successfully, because otherwise I'm limited by the head teacher or the department, because 81 will get exam results. Okay. And that's that.
Thank you very much, Rabina. I'm going to ask Richard Dawkins and James Conroy to respond, and then the other two if they've got anything they'd like to add. Richard.
Well, first, I'm delighted to have caused so much pleasure. Thank you very much. You asked why I'm so aggressive. I'm actually less aggressive than you think I am, especially if you've been reading the papers last week. I don't think I've been very aggressive this evening, have I? No. What I do think is that the reason why, not just me, but people like me, are seen as aggressive is that our entire culture has, for centuries really, been brought up to believe that criticism of religion is somehow out of bounds. And therefore, if you use language which would be par for the course in the House of Commons, for example, where really terrible insults are traded, if you say that about religion, somehow everybody shrinks back and says, "Oh, you can't say that." Well, I don't actually use language anything like as strident and shrill as you will hear in Parliament or in theatre criticism or restaurant criticism or book criticism. Yet because it's religion, I almost think our ears are tuned to hear it as aggressive, even if it's not. I do think that this is a very important point, and one of the things that makes me closest to aggressive is when I see society privileging religion as opposed to any other kind of views. I'm all for religion having a full access to the megaphones of our society, full access to the same outlets as all the rest of us have. What I would object to is religion being given privileged access, which I think it sometimes is. And so that may bring me a little bit closer to being the aggressive maniac that I'm sometimes portrayed as.
Thank you very much, Richard. James.
Thank you. I'll respond to both of these. I couldn't agree more that what we saw when we saw good teaching, we're good teachers. I mean, that's a kind of sine qua non. But good teachers on their own are often insufficient when they have insufficient regard institutionally. And these are often questions of how one feels professionally in a situation where other colleagues are much richer in resource, are much richer in esteem, and so forth. And this relates to the examination question. I chaired the Scottish Qualifications Association Exam Board for Religious, Moral and Philosophical Studies for almost 10 years and was on the exam board of the Scottish Examination Board prior to that. I gave up in despair. When I first started out, we were criticised because religious education almost 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago in fact, was too difficult because they used to do this register of language and they wanted to get this kind of notional sameness about the humanities. And so we would get criticised because we were making too many intellectual and vocabulary demands. So gradually what you saw was religious education in the exam syllabus get downgraded in linguistic and conceptual terms over many years. The consequence of that was then that exam boards started to produce their own books, and as research by Robert and his colleagues has demonstrated, a lot of that is pretty shoddy stuff. Really quite shoddy. And they have gotten away with it. And this, you see this more generally in education, but I think it's writ large in religious education because of the anxieties, the professional anxieties that many, even good religious education teachers enjoy.
Thank you. John or Robert, do you want to comment on the questions?
Very quick points.
John.
On the Dr. Ramsey's points to begin with, you might be saying God is back, but people like me would say God never went away. That he's bigger than that. Okay, but actually, I do think the agenda is so much more interesting now. I do think we have got a chance to talk in real terms about religion and its place, and about the fundamentals beneath that. Beneath religion, of course, is faith itself. So I'm really happy about that. Second point about teaching, James, absolutely. The Deering report 10 years ago, a Church of England report, called for teaching to be a vocation recognised by the Church in a much stronger way, and we're still waiting for that, I think. It's absolutely crucial. It's such an important task. And thirdly, the point about that you were raising, Richard, about privileging religion, I understand that. I think what we've got is the difficulty of trying to balance honouring what has shaped us, because if we forget our past, we're in real trouble, but also honouring our contemporary concern about equality. And how we put that together is a real art.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. James, Teach First is good. We're participating in that programme at Warwick. But in terms of conventional teacher training on the postgraduate certificate in education, the numbers were simply halved, with no thought or planning across the country So wherever you were, whatever the quality of your course, you found yourself about to welcome half the number of students that you had the year before. Immediately at Warwick, that put us down to 7. That is a non-viable course, and we had to close it. There was no argument about it. We had to do it. Other courses are struggling on with numbers around that. How many are actually on yours? Yeah, well, these are tiny numbers, and this is a real danger for this subject. You know, what Richard wants is young people who actually are religiously literate. They won't become religiously literate if we haven't got people who themselves are highly qualified in religious studies and related areas. So that's very, very important indeed. Equally important is good pedagogy. Knowing the subject is one thing. Actually knowing how to relate to children, and here when Jim said, you know, dialogue can be very weak, actually we need to work on how to do it, how to get people to engage with one another at depth. That is pedagogy, and it needs time.
Thank you. Richard, I've noticed a lot of points. Richard failed to answer one of the questions, and he just wants to quickly deal with it.
Thank you for putting that question. Why do we not want to learn from religion as opposed to just about religion? I honestly don't think religion has anything useful to teach us. If you think about the possible candidates for what might be useful, in James Conroy's words, he said we need religion to make sense of our world and ourselves. Well, I think we need science for that. And the other thing he said was I forget what it. I mean, look, I've lost the place now. Anyway, something about values and morals. I very much hope that people don't get their values and morals from their religion. And as a matter of fact, our survey showed that the Christians, the ones who tick the Christian box, don't. They were asked specifically where they got their values and morals from. And a majority said, my own inner moral sense. Next most popular reply was parents, family, or friends. Only 10% of the people who tick the Christian box, only 10% said they went to their religion for morals and values. And I don't blame them, because if you go to the Bible, or indeed the Quran, for your morals and values, you're going to end up a very immoral person by the standards of a modern liberal citizen. And if you go to the other reason why you might go to religion, it would be fear of God, fear of hell, something like that. What an ignoble reason for good.
That's sharpened us up a lot. Thank you. Now, there's so many people wanting to speak. I'm going to change what I said before. I'm going to take a group of 6 now to give more people to come in, because I'm frightened we haven't got that much time. So, gentleman there with the beard. Lady there. Gentleman there with glasses. Lady back there. The lady right at the back. And the gentleman here with grey hair. So first was... Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a parent governor of a faith school, actually the first purpose-built Muslim faith school in the UK. As far as I know, still the only purpose-built Muslim school, state-funded school in the UK. I've been a governor there for the last 10 years. And what I'd like to suggest to the panel, it's Gatton Primary School in southwest London. What I'd like to suggest to the panel is that in our recent Ofsted report, we were rated as outstanding in our provision of religious education and outstanding in our community engagement. And we have very healthy engagement with schools of no religious background. We have excellent relations with a Greek Cypriot school, with a Roman Catholic school, with a Church of England school, and with the church across the road. What I would suggest is that faith in our schools is a reflection of the society, and not, to use a biblical term, the genesis of the problem. Where we have segregated societies, as we've seen in Northern Ireland, then you have problems with segregated schooling. Perhaps those schools could be a cause for change. Where we have problems in the northwest of the country, where we have segregated communities, we have problems with segregated schools. But in Tooting, where we have a very pluralistic, a very open, a very mixed society, and of a community, our school reflects that, despite the fact it is a religious school. And I don't think anyone is arguing for poor religious education.
Thank you. Lady there.
Hi, my name's Charlotte Simpson. I'm a freelance radio producer. I'd like to address this largely to Professor Dawkins, and I would like to first of all say you do make debates so much more exciting. Your presence does make them stimulating, but I would like to disagree with you. You've said that 10% of parents in your people in your survey said they got their values from parents, and yet you've promoted...
10% got their values from religion.
Sorry, but you cited what percentage got their values from their parents.
25.
So a higher percentage. But you're promoting, I think, a rather totalitarian idea where parents can't teach their children to be Keynesian if they want to, can't teach their children to be socialist if they want to. I'm a parent. I will teach my child values. Where else is she to get my values if I don't share them with her? Surely it's my role as a parent to share what I believe. I teach her not to be homophobic. I teach her to be right on. I want her to read The Guardian and not the Mail, and that's just my right as a parent to share my views. And I want her to go out and, she doesn't have to follow what I say. She doesn't have to declare herself a Guardian reading 2-year-old, although she is very advanced. I'd be proud if she did.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over there it was. Thank you, yes.
My name is Jeppe Hedder from the Abrahamic Council, which is a new council that tries to mobilize Muslims, Christians, and Jews into enable social change. Now, my question is, could it be possible in the UK for different religious thinkers and teachers to work together to develop and implement good RE?
Thank you. The lady behind you.
My name's Leslie Pryor, and I've spent my professional life, or most of it, working as a religious educator, now in continuing professional development and initial teacher training. I think the threats facing RE are very, very real, but I'd just like to remind everyone that they do not threaten only RE at secondary level. The subject does not begin at age 11. It begins with much younger children, and I'm seriously concerned about the poor quality experience that many people have in being prepared to teach RE in the primary school. I think it was Einstein who said it's almost a miracle that modern teaching methods haven't strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry, and I think he used the word holy in a non-specifically religious sense. And I would like to think that we are doing our very best to foster that holy curiosity of inquiry that so many very young children have, rather than destroying it the further they move up through the education system.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here.
I'm Alan Hayes. I'm from Leicester. I'm a trustee of the British Humanist Association. We are indeed very keen to have good RE, but what is good RE? I have been to the diocesan meetings day meetings on training people for RE. There has been no mention of humanism in any one of those. Now, I think that we are letting children down who do not belong to the religions, whether they're humanist or not. I would like to see an RE where there is a recognition at least that you have to cater for children who are not coming from a religious background, and beyond that, to create a framework within which RE can function that is non-specifically religious, or certainly non-specifically any one religion. I find it distressing that RE is being put across as being about that religion, that religion, that religion, and it is not being brought together at all.
Thank you.
I think this is divisive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, I've forgotten the sixth. Where was it? Who's got the mic? Right at the back, that's where it was. Yes. Sorry, it's the lady right at the back. Yep.
Hello. I think there's something interesting going on around the issue of identification and self-identification, and it's come through in some of the discourse around your...
Elizabeth, can you just say who you are?
Oh, sorry, I'm Elizabeth Hunter, I'm the director of Theos. Around your poll, Richard, but it's a question for the whole panel, really, about how we handle this. You say that we shouldn't label children as Catholic or Muslim or Keynesian.
Or humanist, for that matter.
Or humanist. What do we do if they're self-identifying? If a child says, I am Catholic, I am a humanist, is that a basis which you can then engage in religious education? Should that be the freedom of the child to self-identify? And I think also, for the rest of the panel particularly, I'm just interested in the opt-out for RE, around this issue of how children are and are not self-identifying, is the legal opt-out for RE a parental thing, or can children opt out of RE if they come to the place where they would stop identifying with an interest, I suppose, in the subject?
Thank you. I'm going to, as we've got 6 questions, I'm going to ask all the panellists to respond. I'm going to ask them all to respond briefly, please, and I'm going to kick off with the Bishop of Oxford.
The identification issue, I think, actually, it may be a red herring, because it's about, I think, the terms we use are just shorthand. You know, a Christian child, I'm not assuming a child has got a huge understanding of what that means, but the child comes from a Christian family. However, I absolutely agree that I want to give my children the very best I can. And that will include an introduction to mountains in my case, or music, or rugby. I mean, a whole lot of things I will want to. It's part of my giving the very best I can. I'm not going to say to a child, well, I won't give you any food for the first 15 years until we know whether you actually like food or not. You know, I just give them the best I can. The question about religions coming together, if I understood the question, the RE Council does a superb job. There are 50 faith groups, 50 faith traditions that gather around the RE Council. So I think there's a lot of combined work going on. Trying to be quick. The humanist question, I've just forgotten precisely the detail, but I know the figure is 62 out of 80 of the Sacres, the special what do we call Special Advisory Council? Thank you. We know what we did. Thank you. 62 out of the 80 that were looked at all had humanism as part of it. How well that's taught, I don't know. That's just 3 of the questions.
Thank you. Robert, would you like to respond?
Yes. With regard to people who are within religious traditions working with teachers, I think this country probably has a longer tradition of that than anywhere else. A lot of other European countries are really working on it now. But not only the SACREs, the Standing Advisory Councils for Religious Education, which are now rather underfunded, I might say, are very important indeed. I've been on the Warwickshire one for more years than I care to admit. And I should say we've always had a humanist co-opted member. And there are many humanist co-opted members on these. And I think there is a gradual recognition that within religious education, particularly at later secondary level, that there needs to be a full discussion of secularity as well as religion, and humanism needs to be explored properly. So that's very important. Turning to the issue of identity and identification, it's a difficult one. When I read Richard's work, which I find, extremely interesting, what I read is a kind of an understanding of religion as a set of propositions which are either true or false. What I don't read is what I would call religion as a way of life. And I think I started to begin to understand something about religious diversity when I first came to Coventry in 1972 and met refugees from Uganda, South Asians who'd been given 90 days to get out of the country by General Amin. Now, these were not people mainly of Hindu background, Hindu families, if you like. There were not people who would say, I must be thinking about whether or not I'm going to be reincarnated. That was hardly, or just simply wasn't on the agenda. What was on the agenda was adapting and surviving. And these people adapted and survived because they had the grammar, the language of their tradition to refer to. Now, children are part of that way of life, what Wittgenstein would have called a form of life. They're part of that. They grow up within the family. So in that case, in that sense, I very much agree with John, but I also firmly believe in the concept of autonomy. And we may not all agree about this, but I think that education should be towards autonomy. And gradually young people, my daughters certainly did, make up their own minds about things and they become their own voice. And that's absolutely right. That's what growth and education is all about. And if people do retain a faith, it's never quite the same as that of their parents. It's similar with culture. Culture changes through the generations, and so does the expression of religion.
Thank you. James?
Thank you. I want to go back to this question about parental rights, because I think this is a really critical question in a liberal democratic polity. When my wife and I decided to have children, I didn't scratch my head and think, oh, well, I'll have children for the benefit of the state. We had children because we loved each other, we wanted to give expression to that, we wanted to bring in life into the world, we wanted the fun of that, and it's been tremendous fun, and I wouldn't swap it for anything. But I didn't do it to make the state good. Children are not primarily wards of the state. They are the responsibility of parents. The idea that you can bring up children without having any conversation about what they would like, and all three of my children are quite differently religious from me, and some of it I valorize, and some of it I'm dismayed about. But that's their choice. They're grown-up people. Excuse me. So I really think that this red herring about choice and state control, or the freedom of children to determine their own life stance at an age when they're simply not capable of doing that, would offer a preposterous idea that they were walking around without a discourse of rootedness and value. Now, providing that is within the context of a liberal democratic polity, it seems to me that there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I don't see that it's injurious to children. People should go back and read Richard Peters on autonomy, or Atkinson on brainwashing and indoctrination. We don't do it. Religious education in British schools, whatever else it does or doesn't do, simply does not indoctrinate children, because if it did, it would be a hell of a lot more successful.
Thank you, James. Richard?
Yes. I take the point that you obviously want to bring up your children the way you think, as Guardian readers and so on, as I do. But we don't have schools for Guardian reading children. And we don't label children as Guardian readers just because they're parents. That's all I'm saying. Obviously, I'm in favour of parents influencing their children in any way they like. But don't let the rest of society label a child by the persuasion of the parents. And religion is the only field in which we do that. I was actually slightly disappointed by the humanist spokesman. Even he fell into the trap of, instead of saying we must expose all children to humanism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam, etc., and Hinduism, he said we must respect, I forget his exact words, that those children who come from a humanist background. I don't care what background they come from. I want them to have a proper education, whether or not their parents are humanist. I no more want to call a child a humanist child than a Catholic child. So that's that. The question about self-identification, well, I think that's covered by the point that I don't want to identify them anyway. I want to teach all children the full range of available options. I think if a child self-identified as a post-structuralist in an English class, I think I'd be a little bit skeptical, but I'd probably want to explore the matter a little bit further. But I wouldn't wish to have a sort of separation between post-structuralist children and Levisite children. I mean, it's nonsense to divide children by the ideological predilections of their parents. And why do we make religion the only example where we do this? Just a final consciousness raiser. If you're getting anything of what I'm saying about never labeling a children a Keynesian child or a structuralist child, whenever you hear anybody talking about a Catholic child, an Anglican child, a Muslim child, jump on them. Say, how dare you call the child a Catholic child? Would you call a child a secular humanist child? Of course you wouldn't.
Thank you very much. Now, another round of six. I've got a gentleman there, the one with the blue shirt and tie. I've got a gentleman there just sitting on the aisle, greyish hair. I'm looking for, trying to balance. Can't see any women at the moment. A woman there. Woman here. That's 2-2. Gentleman here. And gentleman there. Okay, so I'm starting there.
I'm James Kidner, Director of Coexist, which is an educational foundation trying to help people understand better religion in a globalized society. And there was discussion at the beginning of this very interesting evening, and thank you to everyone, it's been fascinating, discussion about an apparent sort of binary mindset between utilitarian education and education that is about values and development of self. And I think that actually there is something for the RE debate that can learn from the utilitarian argument. In a globalized society, the sort of views that we've heard on the panel are minority views. Professor Dawkins is very articulate, but he speaks for a tiny proportion of the world's population where religion is growing and growing fast. God is back as a sort of statistical phenomenon, and if the UK is to compete on a global stage, better religious literacy, better engagement with people's values is terribly important. And so I guess my question is whether you feel that RE can be taught simply as a phenomenon, or whether some in-depth engagement with the meaning and the feeling behind it is important to send children out into the world.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
David Conway from Civitas, the Institute for the Study of Civil Society. So far, none of the panelists have mentioned at all the other compulsory component in religious education besides what's come to be now just learning about the six main religions practiced in England and humanism if you're lucky or unlucky. But there is another component, a compulsory daily act of worship, which has fallen into even worse desuetude than the teaching of religious education. And I'd like to put it to the panel that it is actually logically impossible to engage in an act of worship without there being an object of that worship. And if one is merely to teach about religion so that the child is deprived of any nurturance into a faith community which gives them an object to worship, then the compulsory acts of worship will be meaningless, as they were in the case of my child at a community school when they had a harvest festival and being encouraged to give thanks not to the Common Agricultural Policy I'm grateful for, but to the farmers. I'm afraid all notions of nurturing faith have been eliminated quite wrongly from this debate, and it goes back to the very, very wrongful construction that was placed by the teaching profession. In particular, it emanated from John Hull in the late 1980s, when instead of there being religious education being about nurturing some religious belief, focusing on the one that was local to the community, with opt-outs for classes to go off if there were significant minorities. What has been done instead has been a mishmash of multiculturalism, which has deprived all our children of any proper form of nurturance, save outside the oversubscribed faith schools, which have to be the way forward when we have jettisoned this nonsense that religious education has become.
Thanks very much. Lady there.
Thank you. My name's Rebecca, and I'm an English teacher in a Catholic school in East London. I'm also, without making this sound like a confessional, I'm an ex-Catholic atheist, but a pluralist, religious pluralist. I accept everybody and every faith. I'm struck by the pluralism of the panel, and I'm struck by how tepid the heat of the debate actually was, because it appears that actually once we look into it, despite our religious faith or lack thereof, we do all come to a communal point. As an English teacher, I am, in my school, not allowed to teach Harry Potter or the Northern Lights trilogy His Dark Materials trilogy, because of its religious connotations. If that is the case, the problem in the way that I see it as a teacher, is that faith schools are actually being held to ransom by the doctrines of their faith themselves. And with academies and everything else that's happening in terms of funding, where funding is important for these schools, and faith, the faith comes into that as well, how do we stop schools being held to ransom by their faith when money comes into it
is that clear?
Thank you. I can't remember who the fourth person was. Lady here, quite right.
Hello, Ruth Oswald, PhD student at the University of Birmingham and former primary school teacher who was for a short time in charge of RE in a primary school in Birmingham. I was interested in the idea that the panel seemed to reach some kind of consensus on, which was that we shouldn't be privileging the religious position. And I was wondering how we can kind of align ourselves with that when the admissions policies of faith schools in this country still enable faith schools to discriminate on the basis of faith if it is the case that they are oversubscribed. Of course, if they're undersubscribed, they could have to admit all comers, but if they're oversubscribed, it's on the basis of faith, which is why you then get this thing that people say, think of the fees, get on your knees, I think is the little dictum that they use. I mean, aside from the fact that that I don't buy into the myth that private education is better, I wonder what the panel think of these policies and whether they ought to be changed.
Thank you. Who was fifth? Gentleman there was, yep, that's right.
Hi, my name's Dom Castley. I'm just a dad who's making a decision about which school to send my son. So I'm non-professional. The local Catholic school seems to be the best school, but as a secular humanist, I'm kind of struggling at the moment. Question for Professor Dawkins specifically here, but faith is clearly a meme that's evolving all the time. It has to, I think it's being forced to. What does religious education need to evolve into to be acceptable to you? Or another way of looking at it is how can there be a secular approach to provide a structured teaching for morality and ethics, universal values?
Thank you very much. And our final question was, gentleman there.
Stevenson from the Elephant and Castle and a local Christian minister. In the demise of RE, why aren't we using the resource of ministers around the schools? We only work Sundays, and so we've got plenty of time. We've got plenty of time to go in and share the years and years of theological training that we have, and I'm sure that we could offer something to the schools, but there seems to be a reticence to open the doors to those of us who could come and help.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go back to the panel again for the final time. Richard, do you want to respond first to the points which have been raised?
The gentleman over there from Civitas, I think he said, the compulsory daily act of worship would be pointless if you're not worshipping any particular thing, and he sarcastically referred to a Harvest festival where you thank the farmers. That seems to me entirely reasonable. I mean, I was asked to say grace at a big public school dinner. I was asked to say an atheist grace, and I simply said, for what we are about to receive, thank the cook. My colleague Dan Dennett, the distinguished philosopher Daniel Dennett, recently had a very serious heart operation and very, very nearly died. And when he finally recovered, he wrote a lovely article called Thank Goodness. And he said that while he was in grave danger, a lot of people wrote to him and said they were praying for him. And he first of all said, and did you also sacrifice a goat? And then he said, I'm not going to thank God, I'm going to thank the surgeons, the nurses, the laundry staff who dealt with my bloody sheets. I'm going to thank the person who invented the MRI scanner, who invented all the various apparatus, the scientific apparatus which was used to save my life. What a worthwhile sort of thanks to give, rather than to an entity, what the German biologist Ernst Haeckel called a gaseous invertebrate, an entity for which there is no evidence that it even exists. The English teacher who's not allowed to teach Harry Potter or Philip Pullman, I sympathize greatly. There are science teachers, not so much in this country, but in America certainly, and I suspect in Islamic schools here, and in fact I know that, who are not allowed to teach evolution, or they teach the national curriculum, which means that they have to pay lip service to evolution, but they then tell the children, but because of what the Quran says, we don't believe that. And I actually visited one of England's best, I think, Islamic schools, the Madani High School in Leicester, for a television program, and I was shocked rigid by the fact that I was told by the science teacher, every single child in that school does not believe in evolution. And many of them, I interviewed 6 girls, they wanted to be doctors. These are going to be practitioners of a scientific discipline, and they believe that the world was created in 6 days or whatever it is. I mean, this is even worse than not being allowed to teach Harry Potter and Philip Pullman. Discrimination on the basis of faith, well, that of course is a scandal, and it wouldn't happen if we didn't have faith schools of particular faiths. And then the father who hopes that the Catholic school will have evolved to become slightly more acceptable. What would I want to see happen? I would want to see a cessation of indoctrination, a cessation of ever saying to a child, you are a Catholic child, therefore this is what you believe. And instead say, you are a child with an open mind. There are people called Catholics who believe this, there are people called Anglicans who believe that, Muslims believe that, and it's all very interesting to learn what people believe. Ask them why they believe it. Whenever they tell you anything, say, what is the evidence for that? And if they can't answer, as they certainly can't if it's a religious doctrine that they're putting forward, then don't believe a word they say. Go for evidence, evidence, evidence. And bully your teachers until they give you the evidence for what they're telling you.
Thank you, Richard. James, would you like to comment on the questions?
Yes, thank you. The compulsory act of worship, I think, frankly, is a nonsense. So I don't want to delay on that very much. I think this thing about not teaching Harry Potter or Philip Pullman's Dark Materials, I mean, I wouldn't teach Pullman's Dark Materials because I think it's lousy literature. But I would teach the first couple of books of Harry Potter. I think, again, you find these rather idiosyncratic views, but I don't think they represent the vast body of teachers and head teachers in church schools. That's certainly not my experience, and I can't account for every single one. I don't approve of those kinds of censorship. I don't approve of censorship of any kind, but I do approve of teaching people the traditions in which they are nurtured. And I don't think that's indoctrinatory. I mean, I keep saying this. Go back and look at some of the serious philosophical work on what constitutes indoctrination, and you'll find that even in those institutions that think they might like to try and indoctrinate children, that they really don't do it, because they can't do it in a liberal democratic polity. It is one of the great beauties of living in a liberal democratic polity, that even when people are stark raving bonkers, that they can't make everybody else around them stark raving bonkers without some degree of difficulty. I just want to finish on one observation about ignorance, which takes up some of these points. We asked a group of students, teaching students, why it was the nights were longer in the winter than they were in the summer. 30% of them got it right. 50% of them thought that the earth moved further away from the sun in winter. Something like 16% of them thought the sun got colder. And 4% of them thought it was a trick question. So, I mean, ignorance is not simply the prerogative of religious education. It's striated across education, and this is part of its problem.
Thank you very much, Robert.
If I can take up the ministers as helpers one, we all like to have help, don't we? If you're going to teach religious education in a school, you need to be trained, and you need to have some serious skills about being able to represent fairly different points of view. This does not mean that you believe that everything is equally true, nor does it mean that you believe that nothing is true. It means that you learn how to play a professional role. This is not something that you can just pick up. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that visitors into schools are a tremendous resource. Now, this is where it comes in, you see. About 100 years ago, I used to be an RE teacher, and I remember inviting in a Muslim parent And he came, he was an engineer, he came with sheaves of notes. It was tons of notes, and I realized I'd made a mistake because these kids were not going to enjoy this. So I said to him, look, can you remember what you did when you were 11? See, I don't know whether he'd been labelled a Muslim or whether he'd self-identified as a Muslim in Jaffa, but he said, I'll tell you what I can remember. Yes, I'll talk about that. And it was great because he said, I lived in this very hot country. There were orange trees around. And Ramadan, we tried to keep the fast, but as the sun got hotter, we just couldn't. Eventually, up the tree, my brothers and I went, we sank our teeth into the oranges. I think the kids learned quite a lot about Islam from that, and he was not a qualified teacher, but he could come in and he could help. Actually, I think Richard will be a tremendous visitor to schools, but he would need good chairmanship, as we've had
And to conclude, the Bishop of Oxford, John Pritchard.
Just a few of the points that have been raised. The admissions to schools point. In Anglican Church of England schools, let me just reassure you, we have 4,700. Of those, 67 have a policy that excludes, has the majority, by far the majority of Anglican children.
Children of Anglican
67.
parents.
Yeah, indeed. Well, but remember, what I'm saying, Richard, is that shorthand. I absolutely agree with you, but it is it's a useful shorthand. So it's 67 secondary schools, it's a handful of primaries in London, and it's 6 academies. That's out of 4,700 schools. So, and I'm very much in favour of schools being community orientated. The censorship question, gosh, absolutely. It's always dangerous. It's always wrong. It's always counterproductive, to be honest. I mean, I just can't understand why people still do it. Religion as a phenomenon, but more than a phenomenon. The phenomenon thing, we do need to realise, though, that just in terms of my faith, Christian faith, there are 70,000 more Christians every day than there were the day before. And that happens every day, every day, every day. So, there's a huge growth going on. This has to be taken very seriously, worldwide I'm talking about, not in England. But the point was raised just about daily acts of worship. I think we do learn, we learn from in RE, we learn about in RE, and we learn from in the act of worship. And I just go back to that thing, I think science, you have to actually do it, you have to be involved in it, you have to do experiments. And I think worship is part of the religious experiment, as it were. Can I say one final word for Richard? I do think this question of evidence, Richard, is a dangerous one, because evidence comes in all sorts of forms. It isn't just there's physics as evidence, there's biology as evidence, but there's evidence comes from poets, and evidence comes from lovers, and evidence comes from philosophers. There's all kinds of evidence. It isn't just one form of evidence. And so let evidence be rich.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to give myself the privilege of making one comment on the question about the act of worship. I looked into this matter when I was Secretary of State, including spending one Christmas reading the debate in the House of Lords in 1988, which made it not just an act of worship, but a, quote, predominantly Christian act of worship, one of the rare occasions on which the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher was defeated in the House of Lords, not, by the way, Richard, as a result of the bishops playing a particularly active role in that, but by a series of people who, in the Conservative Party, who wanted to see the change. I think there are real issues about the effect of it and whether it works. I hear what, John, you're saying about that, but I certainly think it's a good case for looking at it completely again. And I was just saying to Linda, I don't know how much research has been done on it, but I know many schools where the whole thing is completely a fake that is going forward in a completely unacceptable way. And I would think, actually, from the point of view of the faith themselves, not a good way of proceeding. And I think opening the question up would be a worthwhile thing to do. And I think there'd be better ways of achieving exactly, John, what you're saying by a different kind of device than the act of worship, if I can put it like that. Now, I'm very sorry we've run over. We were supposed to finish at 7, but I thought there were so many people wanting to come in. Indeed, there are now so many people wanting to come in that I ran on. 2 things to say at the end. Firstly, I really want to thank the panel very, very much indeed. I think we've had an excellent set of contributions, and thank you very much for all of them. Secondly, after the first event, we learnt from the first event that we needed both a spiritual and non-spiritual feeding at the end. And so there are drinks at the end for people to circulate, and we'll all be there to answer questions and continue the discussion informally. And finally, I'd just like to thank Coexist, the organisation Coexist, for helping to sponsor this event and helping with the finances of it as well. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. The next is in a fortnight's time on radicalisation, another controversial question. But thank you all for coming and making it, I think, a very interesting, worthwhile evening. Very good.